Welcome back to Bad News Lovers, my series about why the most celebrated romantic interests, especially the male leads, are often the most toxic examples that one can find. And more often than not, we actively celebrate the toxicity and are constantly finding ways to justify it. And I thought I'd do a little deep dive and kind of see why that is. I'm going to link down below and also up here to the first video in the series so that you get a better understanding of where I'm coming from. Today's video is about Sherlock Holmes, which is an unconventional choice because when I was growing up, Sherlock Holmes was not a romantic character. He looked like this guy, who's a very fine actor, and you should check out that series if you haven't seen it. But the books themselves, with their Victorian morality and the characterization of Sherlock, which is very true to that particular period, let's just say that the fan base it attracted when I was young is not exactly the same kind of fan base that we're seeing today. And we'll come to that in a minute. But before I begin, I do want to mention that Sherlock Holmes is the most adapted character in the literary canon. I don't know if that's true of all literature, but it's definitely true of the English language. I've mentioned before that Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the novels, only actually wrote 4 novels as well as a few short stories. But just based on that, the legend of Sherlock Holmes has just exploded across English literature. There have been countless adaptations to stage, to radio, to film, to TV, to streaming. If you have the time, you should go and look up Sherlock Holmes adaptations because the list of people who have played Sherlock Holmes is going to shock you. Literally every famous British actor that you can think of has played him. And there's quite a few Americans in there as well. Sherlock Holmes also has a very large fan following in India. When I grew up, there was a very specific kind of person who used to read Sherlock Holmes and would defend how it was high literature to the dying breath. And if at that point you had ever gone up to them and said, "Oh, don't you think Sherlock is so romantic?" they would have been horrified. Nobody that was reading Sherlock at that time was thinking about doing sexy times with Sherlock. I am firmly convinced that the entire sexy Sherlock genre really came about due to Benedict Cumberbatch. I know a lot of you think that he's sort of unfortunate looking, and we've all seen the memes where he's been compared to various animals, and he definitely does have a very English face, by which I don't mean anything bad. I just mean that, he doesn't look as perfectly chiseled and conventionally handsome as, say, a Hollywood male lead. Which, by the way, is something that British people should be happy for because that's why they get to have these very interesting and varied careers in Hollywood. It's because the homegrown talent can often be too cookie cutter. So good for you and your unusual faces. But coming back to Sherlock starring Benedict Cumberbatch, he looked his best in that first season of Sherlock. He could pretty much have been carved out of marble in some scenes. And I know it's sort of slipped and fallen down a slope in the years since, and that's entirely on the creators and the producers of that show who single-handedly ruined and went to war against the fandom for no good reason, while also writing the show into the ground. But you have to remember, when that show first came out, it was revolutionary. The way they integrated tech and they modernized it and they presented Sherlock with a fresh gaze 150 years or so after he had first appeared in literature. Or maybe it's just 100 years. I'm too lazy to check right now. But basically a long time. They really did pull off a magic trick with that series, and I don't blame the fans or the fandom of Sherlock for losing their goddamn minds. But that particular series also does things with Sherlock's character, where it positions him in the context of modern discourse and therefore makes him a far more sympathetic character because they need to sort of present him in a way that wouldn't offend most people watching TV today. The original Sherlock, in the original canon, isn't just a misunderstood, lonely drug addict, a beautiful boy rebelling against his brother, with an arch nemesis who would go on to become a hot priest. The original Sherlock is a misogynist. He never picks up after himself. He's emotionally distant. He's very laser focused on crime to the point where he is practically illiterate about anything finer. He lives within this very narrow focused world, and probably music is the only thing that he actually appreciates other than crime. He lives with his best mate. He charms his landlady into fetching and carrying for him. He has no friends other than Watson, probably because he is a condescending twat. He's constantly pushing his nose in where it doesn't belong. And he's a drug addict. Forget bringing him home to mother. This is not a man that you want to invite into your home. Now, to be fair, like most of the adaptations that you'll see throughout the 20th century, they do focus on these things and they do make it clear. But by aging Sherlock down and casting this beautiful boy with curly locks, what the producers of Sherlock did is locate Sherlock Holmes within the popular discourse as just another misunderstood rich boy. And we as a society are basically conditioned to forgive and love characters like that. If a poor person or a significantly less beautiful person were to do half the things that Sherlock does, even the new Sherlock does, you wouldn't find him so charming at all. I mean, look at the other adaptations, the recent adaptations of Sherlock. For example, you have House MD, which had the amazing Hugh Laurie. And they changed the setting to a medical one, and they made him into a doctor, and they literally gave him the power of life and death. Once again, assholes are bad, but asshole doctors, we'll forgive them a great deal. Similarly, if you look at the Johnny Lee Miller adaptation with Lucy Liu, which by the way is a very solid mystery of the week detective show, and I'm very sad that it ended, mainly because I love Johnny Lee Miller. But even in that show, although Miller does a much better job of portraying his addiction and the toll that it takes upon his life, and how Sherlock isn't just some misunderstood boy, he's an addict. And the fact that he solves these cases are basically a facet of his addiction. And it's a brilliant choice, and he does it really well. And if you haven't watched the show, I highly recommend it. But even there, Miller's character is basically a rich boy, and he's rebelling against his father, and you have that entire trope to fall back on and to elicit sympathy. Even in the version with Ian McKellen, where he plays Sherlock Holmes but with a case of dementia, and it's a very different kind of Sherlock Holmes film in that it's sort of sad and beautiful, and it's Ian McKellen, and he sort of brings shades to that character that I don't think any of the other adaptations has. And he is still a person who has financial control, and the fact that Holmes is a person with money is still true in that adaptation. I know the Japanese love Sherlock Holmes, and they've made a bunch of different adaptations. I've never seen one. I really want to. If you have a favorite, leave me a comment and I'd love to check it out. And I don't know if it's true in the Japanese adaptations, but in each of the English language adaptations of Sherlock, whatever else might change, there are two things that never change. One is that Sherlock has money, and the other is that he is a tremendous prick. And one of the lasting legacies of the Sherlock Holmes character has been that it sort of really propped up this idea that if you're the smartest person in the room, then that gives you carte blanche to be a horrible human being. You can be rude, you can be condescending, you can belittle people, you can indulge in any number of vices, and that's fine because you're special. Well, Auntie Amrita is here to tell you that that's not true. I don't care how special you are. you can learn to behave. But coming back to Sherlock as a romantic character, I think one of the reasons why it has continued to be such a big part of the Sherlock Holmes mystique is the fact that he is basically, in the original novels, he's what can only be termed asexual in modern parlance. I don't think the Victorians really had a term for that. I think they definitely had asexuality, but I think they just called it, the gentleman who lives alone. But I think the fact that Watson lives with him has also contributed to the idea that he might have been secretly gay, and that maybe Arthur Conan Doyle was a prude, or maybe he was homophobic and he didn't want to really express what was going on. And perhaps there are all these clues that you can knit together and make the case for Sherlock being gay. And then when Sherlock, the series with Benedict Cumberbatch, came out, his chemistry with Martin Freeman was so profound, and I don't think they intended it. I mean, I'm pretty sure they didn't intend it, given the reactions of pretty much everybody in the cast and crew, and the writer especially. But this is how modern fandoms behave, you look at something, and especially queer fandoms, because there has been so little representation. If you look over centuries of literature and 120 years of cinema, queer representation has been so coded and so sporadic that LGBTQ fans have gotten very used to creating a whole other LGBTQ canon in the fandom. And look, it does no harm. Frequently, it's more interesting than the straight canon, whether it's in terms of fan fiction or in terms of discourse or just, viral threads online. I don't know. I don't care. They're often more interesting. They can take something that's like really vanilla, and I'll watch it and I'll be like, I don't get it. What's the big deal? And then gay people will start talking about fan casting and about ships and alt theories, and suddenly I'll be like, oh, I never thought of it that way. That's actually really interesting. But the reaction of the people in Sherlock, not Cumberbatch himself, but definitely Martin Freeman and the writer, it really bothered me. I have no idea why they were so angry about it. These are people who worked in film and TV for years. I, as a consumer, avid or not, should not know more about fandoms and how they operate than the people whose literal careers depend upon them. If it hadn't been for the fandom, Sherlock would not have gone viral the way it did. Anyway, to dial things back away from just the series, the character of Sherlock Holmes and his sexuality are always going to be a topic of discussion and a topic of debate, because there's so many things that have not been explained and have not been spelled out, and that gives you space to reinterpret and to adapt things in ways that perhaps the original author didn't intend. And that's fine, just to be clear. I don't know how many more times I can say this, but if you can turn Sherlock Holmes into a doctor in America, then you can definitely speculate a little bit about where he's warming his toes. I personally think that Sherlock Holmes as an asexual character is a lot more interesting because A, we don't see a lot of asexual characters in literature or in popular literature or in popular media. But also it helps to focus back on the fact that he's an addict, because his addiction is so overwhelming and overpowering that he literally cannot focus on his personal life. I don't know how things are going to evolve with Sherlock from this moment on, because now we have him as a romantic male lead and we've aged him down and we've seen the effect that it can have on fandoms. And so going forward, are we going to see more romantic Sherlocks, and what is that going to look like? I'm particularly interested in the new Netflix adaptation, Enola Holmes. I just saw the trailer yesterday and it was fantastic and fun, and it had Henry Cavill as Sherlock. The series is really about his sister, but Henry Cavill is not a person who I have seen be truly unpleasant. Even his character in The Tudors, while he was a horrible human being, was really likable because Henry Cavill is really likable and sort of harmless. So I'm really interested to see how he portrays Sherlock Holmes in this series. And I believe it's based on a YA series, so how are they going to really tackle all the grimy bits of Sherlock? And it's also interesting because I think from the trailer, Cavill's Holmes is a figure of authority for his younger sister. And that's interesting to me because in all the recent adaptations, we've seen Sherlock Holmes as a person who is actively fighting against the establishment and against authority. And now suddenly he is the authority, which is both a departure and not. I mean, it's a break in recent tradition, but if you look at the novels and the canon, Sherlock Holmes is really a law unto himself, and he is definitely working for the moneyed class. Do any of you care about Sherlock as a romantic interest, or does your interest only extend to Benedict Cumberbatch? Let me know in the comments.